Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to JWA's Film Club. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I'm really excited to be back with you tonight for this third session of our new series. Please, as always, say hello in the chat. Make sure to chat to everyone. We love to know who's with us. You'll also put your questions there as we get into the conversation. Really glad to be together, and frankly, could not be more thrilled to talk about this film tonight. One of my very favorite movies of all time. I've been joking that I just may have orchestrated my entire career at JWA expressly for the purpose of being able to have a program about Dirty Dancing. So dreams fulfilled here. Before we begin our conversation, I want to say a few words about JWA for anyone with us who is new to us tonight. JWA is a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture through documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We believe very fervently that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. And we offer many opportunities to bring the lenses of history and gender to the pressing issues of our time. These virtual programs, which we've been doing almost weekly since the beginning of the pandemic, are just one piece of JWA's work. And I encourage you to check out jwa.org to learn more about all that we have to offer. A quick logistical note, if you would like captioning, you can click the CC button on the bottom where it says show captions, and that should work for you. I am really thrilled to introduce our panelist for tonight, Irin Carmon. Irin is a senior correspondent at New York Magazine, where she covers gender, law, and politics, and more. She is the co-author of the New York Times bestselling book, Notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which is somewhere behind me on my shelf. Irin's New York Magazine feature, The Tiger Mom and the Hornet's Nest, won a 2021 Front Page Award for Best Interview from the Newswomen's Club. Her work for the Washington Post, breaking the news of sexual harassment and assault allegations against Charlie Rose, resulted in his removal from PBS and CBS. And that reporting with the Post Amy Brittain won a 2018 Mirror Award from the Newhouse School at Syracuse University. Previously, Irin was a CNN contributor and a contributing writer to the Washington Post Outlook, and a national reporter at MSNBC and NBC News, and a staff writer at Salon and Jezebel. She is currently working on a book called Unbearable: Being Pregnant in America, about the impact of the Dobbs decision. And I very much look forward to hearing more about that and reading that when it's out. And she lives in New York City with her husband and 2 daughters. We are so happy to have you with us tonight, Irin. Welcome.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I know your love of Dirty Dancing, like mine, goes way back. Maybe we could start by you telling us when you first saw Dirty Dancing and what you remember from the early days of your appreciation of the movie.
I'm pretty sure my babysitter was the first person to show it to me. It came out in 1987, I believe, when I was 4 years old. And I have just so many memories of watching it as a kid. And it must have started with this babysitter that we had, who, was probably a teenager at that point. My sister and I think at some point we got our hands on a VHS, watched it so many times, my mother had to hide it because she suddenly realized that there was a sex scene in it, and we were like 6 and 8 years old. Sometimes she would just make us leave the room during it, which obviously just made us more and more interested. My sister and I used to do the dances. Yeah, it was a huge part of my youthful consciousness. Of course, there were so many themes that turned out to also shape my life and my work. But at the time, that they were probably just seeping in subconsciously.
At what point do you think you started to see it as more than just a, romance, dance, music, festivity kind of show?
My sister and I just kept having ritual rewatchings of it, and it slowly dawned on me. I had always really considered myself a feminist. I don't know how much of it was that movie, but I think the feminism was also kind of let's be real, Patrick Swayze, the dance sequences. I don't think I realized as a child how Jewish it was, but that very slowly dawned on me once I was a young adult. And there came a certain point, I couldn't tell you exactly when it was, but there came a point where I realized that the driving plot line of the movie was the need to pay for an abortion and the need to access a safe abortion. Mm-hmm. And by that point, must have been by then, I was already reporting on this stuff. And I got the chance to write about it when I became a staff writer at Jezebel, and I did a series that was focused on rewatching movies with political themes. And at that point, I got to interview Eleanor Bergstein, the great Eleanor Bergstein, who wrote the movie and based it on some experiences that she had in her own life. And it was incredible to learn that she, in fact, had intended all of those political themes that only, I only really absorbed intellectually. I maybe subconsciously absorbed them before that as an adult.
It was about 5 years ago when Dirty Dancing was celebrating its 30th anniversary. JWA did a podcast episode about the film, and we interviewed Linda Gottlieb, one of the producers, the main producer. And one of the things that was so interesting as we were exploring that her story and talking, to friends about their own experiences watching Dirty Dancing was how many people really hadn't noticed the abortion plot or hadn't even thought of the film as having Jewish, a Jewish story. I saw the film when it first came out in 1987. I was on the cusp of turning 14 and identified so much with Baby because I was frizzy haired and kind of awkward and outspoken and would totally say something like I carried a watermelon. And I remember just like the excitement of seeing someone on screen who looked sort of like me and who, had this kind of like assertive sense of herself and who gets the guy. And I just remember like dancing down the street afterwards with my friend and just being like, oh my God, there's this joy. But even then, I don't know that I would have necessarily thought of it, like made the connection explicitly of how Jewish it was. And it's kind of an interesting way that, so many people who kind of came to that part of the plot a little bit later and sort of began to unpack like, oh, maybe this is part of why it resonates. And maybe this is part of why it is so powerful, not just because of the sexiness and the music and the dancing, but just the kind of implicit messages there about how we think about social change, how we think about women, all of those pieces.
Yeah, I there's so much to unpack actually about this movie that was really dismissed. And we should say that when it first came out, I think they barely released it. It was full of, drama in the production. Jennifer Grey and Patrick Swayze didn't get along. The studio thought it was going to be a disaster. Eleanor Bergstein told me at one point, the only thing that the studio thought would salvage the movie is to get Clearasil to sponsor it. And they would do so on the condition that there was a giant, like for those who are not familiar, this was like a pimple cream. They wanted to put a giant Clearasil logo on the poster. And Eleanor obviously wanted to refuse, but at the same time, the studio was threatening the existence of the movie. And Clearasil said, there is one condition, and that is that you edit out the abortion. Now, Eleanor was very deliberate about her choice to include an abortion in the movie, even if, and apparently, did so successfully because many of us didn't even absorb that. We just thought it was a really cool movie, and maybe we were just kind of like by osmosis reinforcing our pro-choice values. But she very intentionally made the abortion something that the plot would not exist without. It was woven in, so it was actually impossible to edit out the abortion. And she did so in the context of fearing that the Reagan administration would, through stacking the Supreme Court, bring about the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And so I just thought that was really gutsy, and it ended up being the reason also that there weren't Clearasil like logos on the poster. So it worked in a lot of different ways that was really successful. The Jewishness, it's a Jewishness of a very particular time and place. It wasn't my context because my family was from Israel and we did not go to the Borscht Belt. But so I think also that was also why I didn't recognize it. But now, as a more culturally literate adult, to see, for example, the Borscht Belt comedian, the Yiddish words, they never explicitly say it, but you can see, and I wrote about this in my piece, that this is the generation they have created this resort area for themselves because they've been excluded everywhere else. This is a generation in which, they're finally being allowed into the medical schools that didn't allow them, such as Yale, trying to kind of be more American, more even like waspy aesthetics, like Neil with the white sweater, reading Ayn Rand and so on, like super, super assimilationist. So what we're actually seeing is a kind of like a version of Judaism where they wanted to, create a kind of like copy of what they saw as American life, but there's still tons of manifesting Jewishness manifesting through that.
Right. Both, I mean, from the little details like the food that they eat, the pickles and the pot roast and all of that, to some of the kind of commitment to, activism that we see coming through Baby, which there's a lot of ambivalence about, right? Because Baby is sort of seen as, she's not normative for a girl, certainly. And she, very much in contrast to her sister. And she, she has absorbed a certain sense of what change should look like, but hasn't been encouraged to challenge everything, particularly around class, which is what, kind of comes up. And I think in some ways the class politics are more front and center and come out right away because they're so explicitly framed in that, in that early scene where you see Max making the distinction between the waiters, who he's encouraging to, wine and dine the girls, even the dogs, as he says, and the entertainment staff, who he says, keep your hands off. And that set up very much from the get-go. And Baby is sort of has a weird position there because she's certainly a guest and she's sort of dismissed by some, but she also, it's interesting, you keep seeing her working, right? Like when they arrive, she's helping unload the bags. And when she tries to talk to Robbie, she's helping him fill the water glasses. And it's kind of interesting to see the ways in which she is like performing her not quite fitting into the milieu that of the guests, as part of her identification maybe with the staff, or her wanting to be more part of that world.
I mean, as I recall, if you look really closely, Baby is reading like a Marxist agrarian text in the beginning.
Right. The plight of
she
the
says,
peasant, I think.
Yes. And she says she wants to major in economics of underdeveloped countries, and she's going to go to, was it Mount Holyoke, I think?
Right, yes, she's starting at Mount Holyoke and then going to join the Peace Corps.
Right. And that's, I mean, this is going to be very familiar to lots of folks listening here. What you see is that her family has eked out a place in the middle class or the upper middle class. And she's saying, even in the opening narration, she's describing this as a really innocent time because it's before President Kennedy was assassinated. And what you see is the seeds of her being that activist boomer generation, right? Feminism, civil rights. Civil rights already is kind of hinted at because Neil says he's going to go freedom riding with the busboys, even though he's a total jerk. But so that's in the air, but you don't see any kind of hints of feminism, but you can see that the seeds of them are in her. And you can see that her sort of questioning of authority and so on is also kind of representative of a generation that would go on to challenge these institutions in the mid to late 60s and the early 70s. You could totally see Baby, marching down the streets of Washington or New York City on behalf of women's rights.
Right. Yeah, I actually, one of the pieces, I've written various pieces about Dirty Dancing over the years. And in one of them, I imagined where she might go after Kellerman's, right? Like where does she end up after the end of the movie? We know that she's starting in Mount Holyoke. We know she said she wanted to go to the Peace Corps, but I sort of had this whole image that, okay, she goes to college in the fall, but then the next summer in 1964, I imagine that she goes not back to Kellerman's, but to Mississippi to be part of Mississippi Freedom Summer. And that she would, become part of the civil rights movement. And maybe she would, herself get pregnant and need to find an abortion, and that her experience maybe, and maybe her experience in the civil rights movement, like many other women who found that despite their organizing skills, they were kind of had a second class role in terms of what they were allowed to do, leads her to discover feminism and discover that actually some of the male leaders in, who she meets in the civil rights movement are just kind of scruffier versions of Robbie and maybe not always so nice to women either. And that I was imagining like she graduates from college in 1967. She moves to New York just in time to join a consciousness raising group and to become a feminist. And then I sort of had fun imagining like where she might end up after that, you know, like, does she go in the Peace Corps? Does she become a lawyer for the ACLU? Does she become a radical lesbian and join a commune? I sort of had this idea that if she followed that trajectory, she may, by the 1990s, become more interested in exploring some of her Jewish roots and like join a Rosh Chodesh group or have an adult bat mitzvah or get involved in, you know, a women's dialogue group.
I mean, you mentioned the ACLU. I think, you know, she would be right on schedule. She goes to Mount Holyoke for 4 years, and then she, you know, spends a year as an activist who goes to Columbia Law School, and her professor is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You know,
exactly, and she becomes
the ACLU.
Right. She becomes one of the early people in the Women's Project there, and you know, she could be on the Supreme Court now for all we know. But yeah, it's fun to be able to imagine that path, and the fact that it's so easy to imagine what those different kind of historical milestones are that she could hit is also speaks to some of the Jewishness of that trajectory, right? Like there is a particular path there that was well trod by many young women like Baby.
Yes.
One of the things that was also interesting when we spoke with Linda was that she was saying that, you know, there were so many ways in which the movie was dismissed by Hollywood that just could not imagine that this story would be interesting because it didn't have a traditionally attractive main actress, because it was a women's story, because it was a Jewish story, you know, that and that sort of allowed them to get away with a lot of things that they might not have been able to get away with otherwise, which I think is also really kind of interesting.
Yeah. Is it okay to address some of the questions?
Yeah, no, I see we have a lot of questions, especially about some of the depictions of Jews in the movie, some questions about other popular culture around abortion. Were there particular ones you wanted to turn to?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I think the most recent couple times that I saw the movie, I had a little bit more of a critical lens actually about some of the representation of Jews. There is something kind of internalized anti-Semitic that the villain that she doesn't want to date is so like nebbishy Jewish, and he's so bragging about his money, you know, and that only this man who is not Jewish has a soul, and it, you know, like Robbie's a jerk, Neil's a jerk. Her dad is, I mean, God, I love Jerry Orbach. You know, I crossed over at a certain age to thinking like Jerry Orbach was just as hot as Patrick Swayze. That
is a milestone.
It's a milestone. God, I mean,
well, and he's so young in this movie also. Like if you knew him from older things, you're sort of like, oh my God, he's so sweet.
He's a handsome man with wonderful presence. Yeah. You know, he's a positive figure, but he's also kind of a hypocrite. He's telling her to change the world, but he's also saying to her, like, how, you know, he's upset that she's growing up too fast, but he also kind of looks down on Johnny as much as he likes. Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on her name. The character played by Cynthia Rhodes, the dancer, and Penny. Wow, see, I can remember the actress's name. But I think that also may be a generational thing to say, of like the sort of rebellious baby boomer generation, to say, you know, we weren't like those nerdy Jews or like those money obsessed Jews. So there is some part of me, and there's another thing that this doesn't have to do with the Jewish question as much, but I also felt like watching the movie most recent times, even though I loved it, there is also kind of an exoticization of Black and Latin American music. Like sexuality and forbiddenness is represented by the music of people of color, which probably is true to their experience, but isn't really interrogated.
Totally.
I thought about this when I had a screening in my house with a bunch of friends, some of whom were people of color who had never seen it before. And I was sort of looking at them thinking like, oh, what are they thinking watching this? Which is just like, ooh, the scary, forbidden music. But there are only 2 Black characters in the whole movie, and they never speak. And the music is all from Latin America. Or no, there's 3. There's the 2 dancers, and then there's the Afro-Latin band leader,
right,
who gets a couple of lines. But It's like their music is just sort of like standing in there, without any kind of, I don't know, like characterization or interrogation of what it means to have that stand in for like exotic sexuality.
Right. And to have it represented by mostly white actors. And also the truth is, I don't know that a place like Kellerman's would actually have had integrated staff at that time, or certainly not.
No, it's like the 80s thing. But there's a
Right.
lot of anachronisms in the movie. Let's put it that way. Like half the music is from the 80s and the other half is from the 60s. It's kind of
Right.
like they were
And
not
their
they were
hair
not trying
too.
to be like
All
yeah,
of the
the
staff,
hair.
like they have like big bangs. I was like, that is what my hair looked like in 1987. That is not a style from 63, but they would have a lot more, they would have stiff hair, but it would look a little bit different. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of elision of the racial politics, and there's a lot of, in terms of class as well. There's a lot of sort of reduction in there too, right? Like the working class folks are more authentic, more fun, more exciting. They're kind of more real on some level. And that is that isn't really interrogated.
So I also want to address some of the people bringing up great representations of abortion on screen. I want to say my sister-in-law, actually another Jewish feminist who loves Dirty Dancing, is part of the Abortion on Screen project at the University of California, San Francisco, and they have a database that is searchable by anyone. Sorry, I don't have a link at my disposal. Maybe someone can throw one into the chat. It's called Abortion on Screen, and it's at UCSF. And they have an entire searchable database where you can find any of, like, from the very beginning of movies and TV till today, and they update it constantly, keeping track of how abortion is represented, what it means, how representative is it of reality. And it's just a really interesting resource. I highly recommend looking up.
Yeah, that is really cool. I mean, I think some of the things, despite the fact that the abortion plot sort of was under the radar for some folks, I think it's really quite radical in how it's presented. I mean, first of all, there still aren't that many movies that deal head on with abortion, and in a way that's not where the question isn't will she or won't she. That's never a question here, really. The question is she going to be able to access it? Not like, is this the right decision? It's not a moral question. And it's really framed in terms of class. Like, Baby can get the money, Penny can't. We never see Baby waver about the abortion. There's that moment where her father says, it's not for something illegal, is it? And she sort of swallows and says, no, Daddy. But she doesn't have any moment of feeling like, is this the right thing to do? It's clear to her from the outset that this is what Penny has to do, and that and that it's like totally not fair that Robbie isn't gonna, help. And it's also, I think, interesting that for all of the ways in which Dr. Hausman is disappointed in Baby and like upset that this was something abortion, he also doesn't hesitate to help. He doesn't say like, this is illegal, I can't be here, right? I think I noticed that particularly, I think, now when we see that there are a lot of doctors in different states who are not able to provide medical care because of current abortion bans and the risk that it would put them under. And he doesn't hesitate there. So even though he could be implicated. So that was kind of interesting.
And I saw somebody comment, I saw somebody make a good point that his character, although he does begin in a kind of disparaging place, he eventually understands, even though he's sad that his daughter's growing up, he does grow to be proud of her at the end. So that's a very good point that somebody made.
Right. I mean, I think also I count that in some ways as a part of what is admirable about the character of Baby, is that it's not just that she, has her own kind of awakening and, what some people see as sort of the ugly duckling storyline, that she kind of comes into her own, but she actually changes the people around her. Like, it's not just that she gets the guy, which in itself is a huge deal. And I know Linda Gottlieb talked about the fact that she saw this film as being like a counterpoint or a correction to something like The Way We Were, where Barbara Streisand also is a kind of, political, assertive Jewish woman, not, sort of WASP type in terms of looks or style. And she ultimately, not to spoil that movie, although I guess you can't spoil something that's more than 50 years old. She doesn't get to hold on to Robert Redford. Now, of course, Baby doesn't get to keep Johnny either, but you're never in doubt that he loves her as much as she loves him. And he like, publicly says like, she's the kind of person I want to be. She's made me a better person. And I think that piece of it's not just about her changing, it's about the way that she's changing other people around her. The fact that her father changes too, I sort of credit to Baby as much as, as a positive thing about Dr. Hausman.
Yeah, and if we were to use a contemporary lens, we've been talking a little bit about economic privilege and class status, and this feeling of people who had been discriminated against so much suddenly having status within the context of this Catskills resort, within the context of the US finally letting them into some of these institutions and being able to finally kind of be economically stable. She's using her privilege for good, right? And I think that that's a model that she, in some way, like he says to her at one point, I never met anyone like you, you see something you want to, and you see someone, you want to help them, that kind of confidence that she has, this feeling of like, yeah, and I'm just gonna like go and learn how to do the dance, even though like, don't think too hard about the timeline, right? Like, and the probability and why, and like really literally no one else, like, it's just like, don't try to interrogate the plot too hard. Because it makes no sense if you think about it. And then they go all this way to do like one dance. Better to completely suspend disbelief about some of the technical aspects.
For sure.
But it is driven by her having the chutzpah and like in some way being raised to believe you can change the world, which she refers to, and you can do anything you want. I mean, this is part of this generation that grew up in the post-war era, part of their birthright of joining. They still have like one foot in the immigrant experience through their parents or grandparents, but they have the security of American life, and that kind of creates a potent combination of feeling a confidence to say like, I can fix it, I can change it, somebody should just listen to what I have to say, and if only they understood you, and so on. And that, I think that also propels a lot of social change in the real world.
Right.
So a combination of chutzpah and arrogance, frankly.
Right. And entitlement on some level, like believing that, and she comes to acknowledge that as a kind of privilege. She starts to realize that, oh, it's actually because of privilege that I assume that things are going to, she doesn't use that word, but she comes to realize like my assumption that things can be worked out is because I have certain resources at my disposal. And she becomes a little hardened by that. But I also love that Johnny comes to appreciate that in her too, because there is a certain amount of strength behind it. Emily's pointing out that the name Baby as a counterpoint to that confidence is really interesting. And one of my favorite things in the movie is where he says, what's your real name? And she says, Frances, after Frances Perkins, the first woman in the cabinet, which just feels like it ties in that little bit of history as well. And feels very true to also that generation that would pull out someone who was a standout figure of strength and want to honor them.
Yeah. And I love this comment about kinship ties and family. I mean, I think that you see them through Baby's eyes, that she's sort of wistful about the kinds of bonds and connections, because she's clearly close to her father, but doesn't seem very close to her sister until the end. But the kind of like loyalty and connection going way back, platonic connection between Johnny and Penny is a really good point, I think, that I hadn't really thought of. So thank you for that.
And let's talk a little bit about the mother, because it's to me, it's one of the sort of sadnesses of the story that she's such a non-character in some ways. I think also it's funny, like I was watching it with my daughter at some point a year or two ago, and she was like, it's the mom from Gilmore Girls. It's the grandmother from Gilmore Girls. And that was her association with that character. And I was like, no, the grandmother from Emily Gilmore is actually from Dirty Dancing. So, when you see that figure who shares certain things in common, but is a much stronger character, it's interesting that you see that the mother is sort of very passive here.
So I think that there is actually a logistical backstory to that, which is because somebody has watched a lot of Behind the Music about Dirty Dancing. In my recollection, and I might be a little bit fuzzy on this, the actress who was supposed to play the mother got really ill during the production. And then the actress who was supposed to play Vivian Pressman stepped in for her, but they must have just decided to maybe they didn't film that much of her. And then the woman who plays Vivian Pressman is the choreographer for the movie.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
And so, yeah, so the scene, and then there's the scene where Penny can't be found and she's crying, and that's when that baby finds out that she needs the abortion, and they're in the gazebo. And I think that Johnny is dancing with Vivian, and in that same scene in the gazebo, and then, like the cousin comes to get him, Neil comes to get him, you can also see Eleanor Bergstein dancing in the background.
Right. That's one of the funny things about this, the making of the film, is that they were shooting not in the Catskills, because they were shooting in Virginia, I think, and North Carolina or something like that. And they needed to do it off season. So it was, first of all, cold, and they had to, like, one of our former board members actually was an extra in it because she lived in West Virginia at the time, but it was very challenging because they were looking to have guests who would sort of seem like Jewish guests, and there weren't a lot of Jewish extras in West Virginia and North Carolina. And so they had to, figure out how to bring people in. So a lot of people, including Eleanor, including Linda Gottlieb, had to show up and be in certain scenes at various points. And they also had to spray paint the leaves and do all kinds of things to make it look like it was summer.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think you still get the texture of it despite all of those improvised things. I mean, yeah, there were a lot of, I think there rained all summer in the production, and they had a lot of problems. They all thought this movie's going to be a total disaster, and here it is. We're still talking about it.
I know that in itself is an ugly duckling story, I think.
That's true.
The film became such a one of the best-selling movies and videos, VHS tapes the next year, and the soundtrack also was really popular, and none of those things were expected.
Eleanor also told me, that this, of course, this was based on her own summer experiences in the Catskills. She told me that many of the dance instructors she'd stayed in touch with them, and she would still go dancing with them, and many of them were like manicurists and queens and dancing by night. So certainly the dance team and the dance staff, that's based on real life people.
Yeah. Do you think that there is a shift that happens for the mother or for the sister over the course of the film?
I'm sorry, could you ask that one more time?
Do you think that there's a shift that happens for the mother or for the sister? Do you think that they?
Yeah, the sister starts to see her in a new light because she has this. The mother, I don't think, is a developed character. The sister, I think, there's a part where she says to her at the end, my sister and I say this to each other all the time as like a joke, but I'll do your hair. It'll be real pretty. And then she says,
you could be pretty if you're pretty.
Then she says, wait, it's better your way. Yeah, it's prettier your way. Obviously hair, a big political flashpoint for many people, including Jewish women. And so I thought that was it's she's the pretty one that everyone's talking about being decorative. But she also shows herself to be more observant than people think, because she's understanding that there's something going on and that she's upset that the father is now favoring her. But the main thing, I think, is that in the end, her saying to her, I see you, in a way where she was totally overlooked. I thought that was a profound moment. I'm just looking at this comment that says that that it speaks poorly of Baby's character, that she lies to her father and breaks the law. I also saw a comment about how you would need a doctor to get an abortion, and at that time, because it was illegal. And I want to bring up some other points about that. One is that you could check out this documentary. I believe it's on HBO, about the Janes. Certainly an MD was not the only way to get an abortion. There was an underground of women who had figured out how to use very simple technology to end an early pregnancy on each other. And this was not the kind of back alley butcher that's portrayed in Dirty Dancing, but there were women who had minimal emergency medical training, and this is a technology that is still used in countries where abortion is banned, who were performing abortions on each other. The big problem, or on women who called them, who were desperate, the huge problem was that it was really hard to know if you were getting somebody who was, a credible activist, or somebody who said they were an MD, or were you getting somebody who was taking advantage of the situation. And then in terms of this point about she lied, she broke the law, I see it, especially in our post-Roe world, where so many people are being challenged medical professionals, people in the legal professions, all kind ordinary people are being once again faced with a law that they could very strongly believe is unjust and that victimizes people in desperate situations. They could see it as this is going to reduce harm because an individual could hurt themselves or resort to even more unsafe means. Or they could just say the law is wrong. I believe abortion should be legal. And there's a long tradition of civil disobedience and breaking unjust laws, and even telling lies to your family in the service of that. So just another way to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly like there was, there's centuries of midwives and other folks who performed abortions, and it was part of women's health, and it wasn't even considered illegal really until like the mid 19th century when the American medical establishment was kind of taking over, and part of making abortion illegal was trying to kind of take control and knowledge away from women who were the primary practitioners of medicine at that time and sort of historically. So it's very much, abortion laws are very much tied up in these questions of gender and power and knowledge. And I think also, I mean, even just from this story, we know that this guy who claimed to be a doctor wasn't really a doctor, it seems.
Right.
And in fact, the women from the Jane Collective, when their underground abortion collective began, they were going to someone who was a safe practitioner and who claimed to be a doctor. And then they found out he wasn't a doctor and he was willing to train them in what he knew. And that worked as well as any other legal method. So, it's a little bit blurrier than what it may seem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the movie capture this well.
Yeah. Do you see, like, given that you're very much, you're writing this book about abortion and very much involved in what's going on in this particular dark moment here in the US, do you see this movie kind of having a resurgence of attention around its abortion plot, or do you think that it will?
Yeah, I saw a comment where somebody mentioned that the difference between Fast Times and Ridgemont High in this movie is that abortion is illegal in this movie, and it's more of for the 1987 viewer, it's a cautionary tale, right? To say here's what might happen. In the present day, most of the nightmare has already happened, right? Of course, with the Dobbs decision last year, about half of the states have banned abortion. Most of those states have been able to enforce those laws. Some of it is tied up in state courts. But the medical realities are slightly different than they were in the age of baby. And so, I think that there was the discourse of the 1980s and the 1990s was scaring young women who might not remember what it was like, to say he had a dirty knife at a folding table, to say there were coat hangers. The vanguard of the abortion rights movement right now really hates that. They don't want to talk about it. And it's not because they think that that was a good thing, but it's because abortion technology has changed. And while it may not be right for everyone, which this is another conversation, for many early pregnancies, it is possible to take one or two types of pills in a regimen that will end your pregnancy at home. And it's the same thing that if you live in a legal state, you can get via telemedicine or via going to a clinic. And so I think that the feeling, and rightly or wrongly, this is their feeling, that representations of the bad old days, the dirty knife, the folding table, will scare people into thinking that that's their only option. So yes, that is a big part of history, but the Janes are a part of history, and there is a current network of people who are mailing pills, whether from Europe or even within the United States, from states where it's legal, to get them into the hands of abortion seekers. And so the feeling is too much of this kind of alarmist history, which is real history, obscures the fact that there are safer options if you have to end your pregnancy outside of the law.
Right. Right. So we don't want to read, we don't want to, when we're using history as a tool to raise questions and, look at context, we don't want to oversimplify by kind of assuming that the same models of the past would be applicable to the present. There's really different kinds of issues today, but some of what comes through in this story around access, around class, around just the devastation of what it is to not have that kind of control over one's body.
Yes, absolutely.
Really comes through. And there was a comment here about, like, you know, is abortion really the central theme of this movie? Part of what I think is so interesting about this film is that it really is at the heart. It's sort of the secret heart of the movie in some ways, and represents, I think, a lot of the issues of kind of power and gender that play out in different ways throughout the story.
Yeah, I personally think it's a central theme of the movie, but I have a lot to say about the dance in the movie too. Everyone can pick and choose what they think is the central theme. I know Eleanor really felt that abortion was the central theme, if we want to go to the origin of the creator. But of course, people can take so many different things from this beautiful movie. I think it's a beautiful movie. You know, it's interesting. I spent a few years taking salsa classes, and in fact, when I first met Eleanor, I was taking the class. She was so excited about it. And it's a really interesting way to think about gender roles, because at least as dance is taught and has historically been done, the man is the leader and the woman is the follower. And you have to be a really good follower, and you need a really good leader. The leader needs to be the one who kind of does nonverbal cues about what's next. And it's not the choreography that she's learning, right? Social dancing is you show up and you follow the man's lead in a kind of nonverbal, this is what's going to happen next. You can really kind of chafe at that. But it is a language. And I think some of the most amazing scenes in the movie are the kind of nonverbal communication that happens between them with the dancing, and how she's learning an entirely new language in that way. Although, you know, the dance sequences with Cynthia Rhodes, who's a professional dancer who plays Penny, are still, to my mind, the best ones in the movie. Sorry. And then also in the final sequence where Johnny finally gets to do the dance that he mentions to Neil, where they're dancing up the aisle. I think one of the things that makes this movie unforgettable is that it's wrapped in this incredibly beautiful set of dance moves that get tell a story in their own way, that are their own language.
Right. And it's part of Baby's education as well. You know, again, this is somewhat reductive, but I think the movie does trade in this a little bit. You know, if you think of her as sort of on this intellectual path, and then she learns that there's this whole other way to be, and you see her inhabiting her body in a different way throughout the film. And some of that, I think, is part of the sexual awakening aspect of it, but I think it's also about like learning different ways to communicate and to feel connected. And as we said before, you see that connection between Johnny and Penny so much in their dancing, not just because they're so gorgeous together, but you get the sense that they are, you know, expressing something very intense about their connection through their dancing as well.
Yes, and actually I want to complicate my point, but it's really still my point, which is that although the kind of dance that they're doing has very rigid gender roles, you also see in the character of Johnny a kind of challenging of traditional masculinity in a way that I think is also appeal to like us in our younger versions, because you know, he starts out seeming like this macho guy, but in the end, he shows a lot of sensitivity. We talked about the admiration that he had for her spirit and her challenging of authority. He ends up being kind of, you know, sensitive and upset that she's not introducing him to her father in the same way that, you know, that they come across with Robbie and Lisa. And so, and I think that, I mean, that's a testament to me to Patrick Swayze's performance, where Patrick Swayze took a lot of roles in which he could be profoundly, smolderingly, quote unquote, masculine, while also challenging its boundaries. And to me, that's also something that makes the movie so powerful. He's so strong in who he is, but he also isn't afraid to show a lot of sensitivity. And by the way, and I see somebody posted Vincent Canby's review of it. There's a lot of people who won't get this movie. It's okay. It's not for them.
And I think also time has added layers of meaning just in the ways that generations of people have read it. I don't know that someone reviewing it today could review it the way that Canby did, because it has taken on a certain kind of cultural power that adds to it. I think in terms of Johnny also, part of it is Patrick Swayze's training as in ballet, which allows him to have a certain kind of like grace even in his strength. And you see it also, and I think we should get to the sex scene also. You've called it like the best love scene of all time, and I really what you love about
this
it.
was a few years ago, but yes,
yeah,
I haven't done a whole study, but I think I stand by that.
Right. Well, I think many of us were imprinted with that pretty early, but also there's the moment where where Baby's sort of asking him about his other sexual experiences, and he starts to say, like, you don't understand, these women, they throw their keys at, they put their keys in my pocket and they smell so good. And she says, oh, I get it, you're using them. And he says, no, they're using me. And like, there's a vulnerability there too, that he's saying like, I'm being used in certain ways that I don't fully understand, or
right, that we don't think of men as being able to be sexually exploited, but given the class dynamics and the power dynamics of these older women, and the like being totally a fish out of water. He talks about the luxury of these women, and so it's a kind of, it's not described as assault per se, but there's a coercive aspect to it. There's a kind of dehumanizing aspect to it. That's another way in which it really challenges that the kinds of gender representation that you might see in a mall movie in the 1980s.
Yeah. So what about that sex scene? What do you love about it?
Well, I'm sad to say that I was not able to rewatch the movie this week, but I have rewatched it, at least once or twice a year for my whole life, probably more. But I will say that I remember that I remember the fact that she shows up at his door, right? All along, you're supposed to think like this dance guy is some kind of seducer. And he's obviously interested in her, but he has a kind of like respectful distance. And then she shows up at his door, and she sort of like worms her way into the room, and she's the one who says, dance with me. I mean, the chutzpah, again, of being who she is, and we assume pretty inexperienced, but she has this sort of invitation to him that he accepts, and she's the one escalating it. And I just think that kind of representation of, it's not a seduction, him by her, the older man, the younger woman, it's very much her initiating with his consent, continuing. And again, we talked about the sort of the nonverbal language of dance. I just think it's beautifully done, and it's got a great soundtrack. He's got a great room. I don't know, everything about it to me is just beautifully shot. And it's really a testament to the power of editing, because I saw somebody mention the extended cut, that there's the mother says something like, it happened to me as a little girl. Sometimes less is more. There's an extended DVD version of this love scene, and I don't recommend watching it actually, because it's not good. It's just not good. It was too much. I think that it's both very sensual but very tasteful, or it leaves enough to the imagination.
And she clearly enjoys herself. I mean, I think part of what comes through even from that very first time she sees him, when in that scene in the where Max is talking to the waiters, and then Johnny and the other dancers come in, like you read the desire on her face, and she doesn't try to hide that, right? She's not trying to button it up, and she makes the first move and is like very vulnerable, but also kind of taking charge in that moment.
Yes.
You may have heard that I think the news came out this summer that Jennifer Grey is making I don't know exactly if it's a sequel or a kind of reboot that she's directing, apparently. Any thoughts about that?
I know there have been various attempts to extend the brand. I don't know if it's the same one that I talked to Eleanor about, that she didn't have anything to do with. I don't think I knew actually that Jennifer Grey was involved in this. There was Havana Nights. There have been tributes to this in other movies. To me, the original text is complete. I don't think it needs more, but I'd be happy to be proven wrong.
When we spoke with Linda Gottlieb, she had said, we asked her sort of like, where do you imagine that these characters go afterwards? And she said, I think it's really good we never made a sequel.
Yeah, I think so too, especially, I mean, you actually said you assumed that they don't stay together at the end. I think that's probably right, but it's also pretty open-ended. I mean, it could be that they tried to make it work. It could be that he follows her to Western Mass and then it really doesn't work out, or maybe it does work out. I think probably it doesn't work out. I think everybody realistically will think probably it doesn't work out. But I think it ends right where it needs to end.
Yeah.
It was interesting. After I interviewed Eleanor for that Jezebel story, I asked her if she would do a screening in New York City where the proceeds went to the New York Abortion Access Fund. This was a few years ago. And she had not seen the movie. And so we rented out a theater. Jezebel hosted it. And I sat next to her. She watched it, which was such an intense experience. And my sister was there too. And, so much of this movie is my relationship with my sister. And Eleanor was sobbing throughout the whole thing. And afterwards she just said, I'm seeing so many friends who passed away. Patrick Swayze, the director, one of the dancers, I think had really in a high profile way died of a drug overdose. So, I think it was a perfect moment in time. It was, perfect production. To me, there is no movie without Patrick Swayze.
Yeah.
And so I just thought it's a love letter to people who are also, and by people who are no longer with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in the pieces that I read about Jennifer Grey's reboot, she said there will be characters coming back. And I was thinking to myself, if it's not Patrick Swayze and it's not Jerry Orbach, like who would you want to see? Like,
right. Jerry Orbach too. Right. Yeah, no, don't make them come back in a hologram. It's disrespectful.
No, exactly.
No holograms of Patrick, please.
There's an interesting comment here from Micheline about how Baby has seen what happened to Penny and still chooses to have sex with Johnny.
Oh, what a good point.
Which I think is really interesting, and whether you read that as just about passion or about privilege, or I don't know. I think I sort of see it as like she's very aware. One of the things I love about her is that she has agency, and you get the sense that like she's not like, it's not that she's carried away with passion. She goes to his room very clearly, like she knows what she wants, and she's made the calculation of what's worth it to her, and what, and that it's not like she's swept away.
Yeah. I think there's also it's very clearly that she's at a point in her life where she doesn't want to live life on the sidelines. I mean, you see her in the beginning as kind of a wallflower standing and watching this, and she makes the decision that she's going to go against her upbringing and what her parents expect of her. Clearly, she's been a very high achieving, good girl. But you see that she just says, it's time for me to live my life and to go in there. But yeah, I think it's a good point that she goes from Penny's botched abortion to sex, but also it just shows that she was going into it with her eyes open.
Yeah. I think I was going to ask you about sort of your favorite lines from the movie, but this reminds me of one of the things that's always, you kind of have to love the nobody puts baby in a corner line on some level, but that in some ways struck me as wrong, because the truth is, like, the whole movie is about how she is not allowing herself to just be in the corner. She's like really putting herself somewhere else. So in some ways I felt like it felt a little out of place to me that way.
And it's like a weird pun. The tone felt off to me too.
Yeah.
What are your favorite lines from the movie?
I think one of my favorites is when they're saying goodbye, when Johnny's been kicked out and he says, "I'll never be sorry." And she says, and that just like, I could like cry saying it right now. Like, it just, that every single time, that just completely breaks my heart, but is also just incredibly beautiful that, like, even though this has blown up in their face, they know what they've taken from it, and they know the way they've each grown. And I think that's like the most beautiful testament. What about you?
That is really beautiful and meaningful. I love that scene. And he's singing, Patrick Swayze is singing "She's Like the Wind" in that scene. I don't know. The first lines that come to mind are really funny ones, because I think we haven't talked about humor. To me, there are a few notes of humor, and there's some lines that are like jokes in my household. For example, when Max says, "This Danish is pure protein." We say that all the time when we eat pastries in my house. And then there's the part where Neil, I love the "Love is Strange" sequence. Where there is there sheet music for this? Is such a good line. He has some of the best lines. And so no, his singing is not good. he was good at many things, but not singing. So there's a part where Neil interrupts them when they're singing "Love Is Strange," and he says, why don't we do something different with the year-end show? And Patrick Swayze gets really excited and tells him, Johnny's really excited and tells him about the dance that he is learning with the staff kids. It's a combination of a Cuban dance and etc. And then and he says, we always do the mambo. What if this year we do the pachanga? And so sometimes in my life when we're like, what if we, instead of ordering from this Chinese takeout place, we order from the other Chinese takeout place? It's just this hilarious line of like, I'm gonna do something big and bold that is actually just
pretty much the same.
Yeah, and it's kind of a good moment where we understand his character, and it also just cracks me up.
Yeah, that is pretty funny. I will say, as I mentioned before, I know Patrick Swayze, not known for his singing, but I did love the soundtrack, and I famously taped over my bat mitzvah tape singing with a friend, Hungry Eyes.
That's great. This really is your dance space and this is my dance space. That was my favorite line of my childhood. I love that one.
Yep. And Zelda loves the come on of Baby to Johnny, her true statement about never feeling the rest of my life the way I feel when I'm with you. That's a great one. And Brenda's pointed out, and someone else mentioned this also, I think, that there are these comparisons to Marjorie Morningstar, another film that maybe we'll do in a future JWA film club, in terms of someone who is part of that Catskill scene, kind of experimenting with breaking some of the norms of what Jewish womanhood looks like. Marjorie Morningstar has a very different end. I guess Dirty Dancing leaves it more open-ended. We don't exactly know where she lands, but probably not in Scarsdale or wherever it is that Marjorie Morningstar ends up. But I think it is really interesting to see the way that there are these kinds of like cultural revisiting of certain tropes of what the Catskills could mean and what it means for a woman to think about escaping into dance or theater or something else.
Yeah, we should do it because I've never seen it.
It's an interesting one. Yeah, someone is saying, Linda's saying it's a better book than a film. It's a very long book. But yes, it's worth reading and seeing both of those. Thank you so much, Irin. This was really, really fabulous. Thanks to all of you who participated also in the chat. This was so fun and exciting to be able to pull out all of the themes that are interesting here and that are not just interesting, but like, and not just our, our cultural touchstones, but really are part of the world that we are struggling with today. And I think there's really a lot for us to bring in here as we grapple with 2023 American politics and Jewish politics and gender politics. So glad that we can revisit it with all of that. As always, so much more to explore at JWA. We put into the chat Irin's piece about Dirty Dancing from Jezebel, JWA's podcast episode on Dirty Dancing, a couple of pieces I wrote, and a recent blog post that we had this past summer on Dirty Dancing's 35th anniversary. I hope you will all join us next week, same time, same place, for a discussion of Kissing Jessica Stein with Drew Burnett Gregory, a queer writer, filmmaker, and theater maker. Those of you want to screen it again beforehand, it's available on most of the streaming platforms, Hulu, Prime, Google Play, Apple TV, YouTube. So I look forward to gathering together. Thank you again, Irin. And until next time, everyone, be well and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you so much.